Hello, everybody. Hope you've been doing well, and I am back to try another pre-game analysis video. This is for the first round of the second Malifaux World Series event of 2025, the Let Bygones Be Bygones event. I am coming back to the faction I started the game with in Thunders for this event. The repetition of getting a couple of events in a row, and just sort of generally the consistency of playing a lot of Lucius in general, but Neverborn in particular. While it did make me want to continue to sort of refine my ability to play Neverborn well, it actually just made me feel like I was sort of appreciating the focus on kind of honing craft and getting a little bit more insight and sort of nuanced understanding of stuff. And part of what that made me want to do was to go back to some of the stuff that I've played the most and have felt the most sort of into playing consistently, have sort of felt the best about developing my ability to play well, and putting some sort of similar time and effort into those things. So I'm back on Thunders, which is in aggregate the faction that I've played the most, just in general, and probably the faction I've played the most tournament games with, though I've played tournament games with a pretty broad spread of factions over time. Sticking with them for obviously at least the one event. We'll see past that. I do generally enjoy playing Thunders a fair amount. The way that the faction gives you a lot of tools to try to understand what your opponent is looking to accomplish and build to sort of show that you get their game plan and you recognize how you can kind of attack them in what they're trying to accomplish, right? The sort of like reactive kind of like counter style is something that the faction can do that I really like. The faction is pretty good for card manipulation stuff. It's one of the better factions in the game, I think, for card draw, just general deck manipulation, and I think that in addition to that just being a powerful thing to be able to do, I think one of the generally appealing features of Malifaux is the way that it uses a deck as its randomness mechanic, and the way that can lead to a little bit more interaction on the part of the players with randomness. And sometimes, as I think, Thunders is probably the poster child for this often. Sometimes the ability to engage with that mechanic and manipulate the randomness that you're experiencing in a game can get you into trouble, can kind of lead to some outcomes that are a little sort of iffy from a balance and design standpoint, but it is setting that aside, right? I know that Thunders are very strong. Wouldn't say that I'm going back to the faction, I think, explicitly because I think they're so strong, though they obviously are, and as a competitive player, it certainly isn't a bad thing. It's not discouraging me from playing Thunders that they're very good, though. I will say I'm not traditionally in love with the experience of playing Asami. I certainly don't hate Asami or anything. So it's not the case that I would simply sort of refuse either based on strong aversion or principle to play Asami ever, but I'm not necessarily particularly drawn to playing a lot of Asami. So maybe I will in this event or otherwise, but if I don't, then I think the faction can tolerate that reasonably well, and two, that's okay by me. It's not like I'm going to be missing out on part of the experience I'm especially savoring. Okay, so round one in this event is a matchup. This is an opponent who I have played before in a World Series game, actually, in Brandon Gubbinz, part of the Peck Mentality podcast, who I really enjoyed my prayer game with. That was a very different game on both parts. I played, I believe, Tiri in Outcasts into Tull in Guild. Brendan, of course, played Guild pretty consistently for a while there, maybe a couple of years, maybe less than that, but at least for a time. And this year has found him on Bayou, where he's taking a Captain Zipp crew into I am, brave sort of explore, I guess is the kind of on the nose descriptor. I'm giving McCabe 2 a try, despite his being brutally saddled with the weird clarification from weird. Somewhat joking in that he was certainly quite good before the change, and I think is still fine after the change. I am not alone in that. I would say I'm not particularly fond of that clarification. I think one that I suppose I should back up and say ultimately I think it's not the biggest deal in the world, and Weird does a lot of really great stuff. I really enjoy the game they put out, and they're not the biggest company, so I think very often, and this certainly would apply to me as well, I think very often when people sort of just take it for granted, like, oh, here's this thing that you did that I don't totally like that you did, and, you idiots, like, how could you? You obviously should have done this other thing that would have been so much more effective, and the idea that, oh, that all this stuff is so self-evident, I think is taking a lot for granted in game design in general. I think it's very easy to overestimate how easy it is to sort of know exactly where something is going to sit balance-wise, and sort of like how something is going to play, which is also something I think that players kind of on the inside of a game can not really be thinking about as effectively as they ought to when they're sort of thinking about how they would make adjustments to the game they play. The idea that actually more important than balance is fun. And while obviously you don't want to just ignore a balance, I think sometimes suggestions are like, oh, just do this thing to something, where it's like, well, while that thing might be too strong, it's also fairly popular, and making it miserable to play is not necessarily actually desirable from the standpoint of the people who are running the game. But regardless, the clarification is that McCabe's upgrades basically now sort of like check as like a persistent thing. So one of the benefits you get for attaching one of his trinket upgrades is if you did so this turn, you would gain fast. And basically the way the ruling works is if you had an upgrade previously on a turn, then even if you attach a new upgrade, you can't then use the new upgrade to check and see, I gained an upgrade this turn, I'll gain fast, sort of based on the rationale that you would have had that effect previously, but you wouldn't qualify to gain fast based on the original upgrade, the earlier upgrade. So you can't gain fast unless you didn't already have an upgrade and also attached one this turn. It's actually not that laborious to achieve that. It just then limits a little bit the incentive to throw upgrades around. The sort of like en masse pumping out upgrades, getting a ton of them out turns 1 and turn 2, and then kind of juggling them around as like one of the core crew mechanics is certainly much less incentivized than it was. And just in general, the idea that a lot of your models are going to be fast for a lot of the game is just much less safe as an assumption. That said, McCabe already had other advantages, not that he doesn't also have his sort of counters or limits. He's not, just a perfect juggernaut. But anyway, so setting that aside, this is a Raid the Vaults pool on a map with this big dais in the center here. Certainly a big, interesting terrain piece. And Brendan, starting with Brendan. Brendan has taken a Zip 1 crew, who is probably the Bayou Master that, as a Bayou dilettante, I've probably played the least of myself, sort of to my deficit. I know that Zip is quite good, and I have no sort of good reason for not having played a fair amount of Zip when I play Bayou, but while that doesn't mean that I don't get Zip or know what Zip does, I definitely think that Zip is a pretty good call here, right? Obviously, Zip has some strengths on vaults where his inability to interact doesn't do anything specifically on scenario, because he's still significant. Obviously, he can score, and he is very capable of fighting for vaults and doing quite a lot to secure vaults points just based on the strength of Up We Go, right? Even if he's not just blowing your opponent off of a vault by killing multiple models in an activation. For a pool with this big central terrain piece, he's also pretty fast, right? Obviously, with flight, he can very quickly kind of get in the action and get to a point where he's able to push and kind of like force the issue, which we'll sort of talk about what I think I'm going to see out of Brendan, but I think that's probably actually going to be more or less what he's doing in this case. The flip side, though, and you can kind of see this in the crew that Brendan hired, Zipp's crew, the infamous keyword is certainly not a bad keyword, but it is not a keyword that is particularly suited to locking down specific locations or brawling. It is definitely a more kind of mobility-centric keyword. So while Zipp himself, I think, has a lot of advantages, I guess also that the piano marker generation can kind of be nice on something like Vault, so you can try to like lock your opponent out. I actually don't have any, but if I were to make some, then either Zipp or his totem Earl can start putting down pianos in just kind of like key places where it's like, well, it's just now a little bit hard to stand somewhere where you can easily square the vault, right? So it has some marker control stuff as well. Scheme-wise, we have Let Them Bleed, In Your Face, Outflank, Sweating Bullets, and Take Prisoner. This is a pretty aggressively skewed scheme pool. Outflank is the one mobility marker scheme here, and while on a square deployment and with the mobility of Zipp's crew, it's certainly not the most unreasonable thing to attempt, especially because we have these kind of hiding terrain pieces over to the side here, which, note, I'm the attacker here, and I think I'm the player who was less motivated to want to sort of play for or to sort of allow for outflank. And so one thing sort of looking at this is you might be like, well, wasn't it kind of a bit of a miss to sort of allow for the deployment where there are these kind of like big pieces to hide that way? I think that's pretty feasible either way. This terrain piece would have, I think, very easily have allowed for, regardless of like which side I was on, kind of allowed probably a flying piglet to tuck in somewhere and score. And it would have been a little bit trickier with this one, but given that, I guess if I bring these things back, I think you can still be, if I just sort of proxy this out, you can be reasonably safely positioned on kind of either side. It's not perfectly unassailable, right? But like it would have been a bit of a pain either way for me to have tried to prevent that, even with the other deployment. And if the other deployment is like otherwise worse, then I actually don't think I would have been getting very much. So don't know if that may have been kind of answering a question nobody had, but just to sort of note that while this setup actually makes scoring that scheme somewhat feasible, and it might kind of make it a little bit difficult for me to contest, which, right, because like there are these very natural hiding spots for the piglets over here, and obviously there's significance. They can just wander over and put down schemes. I don't know that there was an alternative that was much better, and I have a fair amount of mobility in my crew, so it's certainly not impossible that I could try to contest that anyway, and that's actually not a just total upside move on Brendan's part, because while the piglets aren't likely to last very long if they're trying to like sort of like hunker down and contribute to vault scoring, there are only so many significant models on the Zipp side, and not that many of them are that well suited to kind of camping out. So even if the piglets would be a little bit flimsy, taking them away and sort of even sort of taking away the potential of trying to use them like as like late activations to just like sneak in on a vault, it's not just a total like upside move for me to have allowed. Anyway, and on my end, so that's the Zipp crew. Final thing to note in this crew is that we have two instances of 12 cups. One is on Zipp himself, unsurprisingly. Almost invariably would be difficult to imagine a situation where you wouldn't put that upgrade on Zipp in Bayou. And then on Uncle Bog as the other kind of like tar pity in the middle of the table model in the Zipp crew. All that makes sense. 6 stones, I believe, as well. Yep, so a reasonable stone count to begin. Not an incredible amount, and I think that stone count is probably going to go down pretty fast, one way or another. There's sort of mutual incentive or there's sort of incentive coming from both crews for that to happen on Brendan's part. Yeah, all in all, a reasonable crew hire. You can see from the name here is that it ever really a new Captain Zipp crew, that I think a lot of these hires are pretty familiar to Brendan from prior games playing Zipp. And I mean, there are a lot of fairly sensible hires, right? McTavish is generically good and fills a niche in that kind of like range skirmisher and damage piece that like it's not like there's another model in a Zipp crew in Infamous that like does anything particularly like that. So not hugely surprising. I guess I should say this event features bans. So in this case, I banned Trixie and Brendan banned Story. And I think Brendan even said so, but when I was sort of talking about the lack of alternatives to McTavish for that kind of role, one of the potential alternatives would have maybe been Jebediah, who also has a pretty good gun and mobility and all that, but obviously Jeb is not hireable here. Anyway, the Zipp crew here is maybe kind of, I'm kind of getting a like here for a good time, not for a long time kind of approach, in that there aren't very many models in the Zipp crew that I think can last very many turns, just kind of like standing and trading with the McCabe crew. So while anything can happen in Malifaux, right? Maybe, flip some cards and just, generally Brendan kind of outplays me, and that proves to be totally false. This could certainly happen. I'm kind of getting the sense that while it might not be a like first activation turn one thing, it would not hugely shock me if Zipp is trying to get up table fairly early, and the element of Zipp's kits that I honestly have kind of always thought is most underrated is I think his gun is really good. I don't necessarily think that's an incredibly hot take, the Zipp Zapper here. It's a range 8. Range 8 is kind of the biggest limiter here, in addition to, because of the weirdness of shadow rules, if, for example, I have a model, like, let's say that Desper ends up, like, over here, I believe Zipp has to get, like, quite close to the edge here, right? Actually kind of close, right about to there, in order to be able to effectively target Desper, whether in at range or in melee, just because you need to be within proximity of the edge, within one of the edge, to then be able to sort of overlook the shadow, given that this is height 3 and Desper and a lot of models. This is a little bit hard to map out, but just like, it's actually, you can essentially, as soon as you are reasonably close to almost like level with the stairs here, you're potentially going to be in the shadow of the larger structure, and that's going to make sniping back and forth a little bit trickier. McTavish, I have him positioned over here. We'll see about that. That was kind of like, right, so he gets the chain gang and then on the move, and he's then, I would imagine, in range to probably take a couple of shots turn one, though presumably if I do in fact deploy like this, then like I will at least have like Monaco as a potential target. The targets that I'm going to have, I will at least probably have them positioned so that he would have to deal with cover to shoot them, which is part of the reason why, while I'm attacker and so Brendan can ask to see where some subset of my models, including Monaco, are, and maybe sort of set up on the opposite side. I was kind of figuring that it made more sense for McTavish to end up flanking over this way, just because the sight lines through here are much clearer, whereas if he ends up boop, 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 then even though this forest is sort of okay for him to work with, this is actually kind of annoying. I can just stand on the other side of that and ignore him for longer than I would assume Brendan wants McTavish to be ignorable. Because I think in terms of attrition and just generally like damage output, Brendan is distinctly at a disadvantage if what we were able to do is basically just line up our resources and line up our like relevant combat model. So for Brendan, that would be mostly Zipp and McTavish and kind of Bog. Bog is at least probably taking melee actions some amount of the time. And then Sammy in supports, right? Sammy not really as much of a damage dealer in her own right, but is like a Jinx, like I will help address the like stat stuff that McCabe has going on with cursed objects. And then maybe just do card stuff with Drain Magic, or maybe this is actually a case where legitimately sometimes Under Pressure might be more annoying, because that has than Glimpse the Void would be, because either one could potentially move one of my models off of a point, but like Under Pressure actually here could then also like generate fall damage or something like that. But regardless, those are both sort of like doing something somewhat similar in generating some displacement, probably for scoring purposes. But so that's kind of right, like Bow has a melee and has blasts on it, but it's very low damage. Piglets have 0-inch bad stat melee without a lot of damage, and Earl is not a combat totem. So that's kind of what we're working with on Brendan's side of things, whereas on my side I have, of course, McCabe, who is probably a better damage source than Zipp. It's a little bit sort of tricky to talk about that, because Zipp has the added benefit of fall damage maybe on this map, and Zipp, because Zipp is so fast, there's sort of the element of how many actions over the course of the game is Zipp taking that are attack actions, right, relative to McCabe. And even if sort of the average value of those actions is lower for Zipp, it might be that it kind of works out to more or better if Zipp is just doing it more. But I have McCabe, I have Monaco, who is sort of a threat. Obviously, her kind of like min damage is not super exciting, but like if we're winding her up against Bog, she's certainly not less capable of damage than Bog, say. I have Kenshiro, who is kind of complicated to talk about damage-wise. He has a very high stat, and he's capable of min 3, even ignoring some stuff, so that stuff is not super relevant into Zipp. But then also he's my kind of equivalent of, he can move models around, so he can generate fall damage, though there aren't very many models in the Zipp crew who are going to be taking any fall damage regardless, because Bog would presumably just laugh off and not. Zipp flies, and so can't take fall damage. McTavish is, I assume, not just like wandering up the middle of the board like this. So, but regardless, I have those guys. Desper, stat 5, not incredible, but stat 5 with a min 2, ignoring armor, again, doesn't really matter, but like it is a damage source, kind of. His gun is okay. Batari is sort of in the same camp as Monaco, where like she has a fine stat and is pretty fast and like capable of generating a reasonable number of attacks, right? She has shove aside. And then my backline stuff of Host and Jesse are, I think, more combat capable than like the Piglets and Bow, say, right? Jesse has a stat 6 gun. Host has a stat 5 gun, but is actually firing into melee at advantage rather than disadvantage. And they also has sort of functional melee. It's not like every model in my list is like all killer, no filler, like incredible damage, but it just doesn't seem likely that, given that I have at least comparable but probably better healing, I have better damage mitigation because I generate shielded, I have incorporeal on some stuff, I have the ability to generate life leech. It just sort of seems likely that if push came to shove in a largely melee-based kind of like war of attrition, I think McCabe is likely to win. And so it seems like it kind of behooves the Zipp crew to not play to that kind of game, to that sort of style of game, because if you are going to sort of win, if you're going to sort of like lose a particular game a high percentage of the time by kind of just default, you kind of can't play it by default, right? You can't just sort of like autopilot to, well, I suppose I'll just sort of do this kind of like generic thing that would be natural to do, ignoring context, when context says that you will sort of pay the price for doing that. And I think where Zipp's advantages actually lie in the matchup are more at range. I do have some guns. Jesse has a gun. Host has a gun. McCabe, in fact, has a gun. I have a lure. It's not called lure, but I have a lure effect on Batari. But I think that all of that doesn't probably add up to as much effective damage as Zipp, especially if Zipp gets lucky and gets some spikes, because Zipp has a spiky damage track on the gun and has blasts everywhere. And notably, the other really good thing about Zapper, it ignores concealment but also cover, and ignoring cover is pretty big, given that I'm often going to have cover. And there are some models like Monaco, like when I was talking about the prospect of McTavish shooting at Monaco and cover, that has this like very uncomfortable like downside of, well, but you're shooting uphill stat-wise into Monaco on her built-in defensive trigger suit, right? And so like, is it even appealing unless you just feel very, very confident that my hand is not good enough to sort of like punish you, to run the risk of very early letting Monaco get that upgrade out, and maybe then letting me summon a one Udo, but in a more kind of attrition-y matchup, even if I never summon that, just the then like, oh, but if you then want to try to like do damage to Monaco, you're just getting all of that back on McTavish, unless you bail on the upgrade. So anyway, I think Brendan is probably trying to play fairly aggressive early, trying to utilize those ranged attacks as much as possible, because I think that's where Brendan is going to have the ability to sort of trade at advantage. And given that a lot of his models are not that durable once we sort of like really get to grips with each other, this sort of like weird balance of, I think Brendan wants to kind of get the party started, because I don't think Zipp can kind of just like take it slow and let me set up, because if I'm allowed to set up, then both of our crews draw some cards. I don't think I'm just going to wildly outcard Brendan by any means, but I think Brendan really, if we both just have strong card access, I think, again, because like in that the resource game is slanted in my direction, I think that actually is bad for Brendan. I think Brendan kind of wants to have a kind of like more scattershot, kind of more scrambling game where neither of us really has quite as much ability to kind of like set ourselves up the way that we would want to. I think that also is sort of further that is all the more true because Zipp's sort of card stuff is not really based on a lot of setup, right? The models in the crew that have showboating, you just sort of take normal activations with them and think a little bit about your cheating, and that's how you're getting your card cycling there. Sammy is the one model that specifically wants a little bit of help in drawing cards by presumably having one of the piglets do a little bit of damaging her over time, but I wouldn't be surprised if even that is done in kind of a limited fashion, because again, I think that's just that sort of like slow turtley, let's kind of like just take a timeout for turn one and then we'll sort of check back with each other turn two dynamic isn't really one that is going to benefit Brendan in net. So I think we're looking at striking a balance of getting McTavish out, trying to do some like flanking, harassing, but like getting meaningful damage into my models. Likely initial targets, I'm thinking some combination of these four are probably the models that I would expect to be in the line of fire the most early, and kind of just dependent on where everything actually ends up deploying, what sort of resources are feasible, a little bit on what Brendan sort of decides on his end makes the most sense. But those are the models in my crew that I think are going to be potentially somewhat pushed forward, not necessarily hugely aggressively, and represent some element of sort of like real value to my game plan. So McTavish shooting from one flank or another, right, sort of setting up to be able to like maybe get into a vault, but like with enough sort of like space to play with that he's also not just like walking up and like walking into like multiple charged lanes turn one or anything like that. And then Zipp probably by getting up and I would say ideally trying to like really, really kind of like get into me and start laying into my crew with the gun. But it's going to be a little bit tough for as long as I don't like really like do something kind of demented and stack up all of my crew on the deployment line just to kind of do it. That seems like that's going to be a little bit hard because the way that I've set things up, this is not really a matchup where I think Zipp is going to very easily be able to really jam himself aggressively into my crew and feel okay about that. It may ultimately still happen just because that's a thing that Zipp often does, and sort of the idea of buying time and just like Zipp being so impactful and disruptive even over the short term that like you can kind of afford to be a little bit ambitious with his placement. But I wouldn't be surprised if he isn't quite played that way in this case, because one of the big things that Zipp normally relies on, in addition to his 2-inch engage and boring conversation as sort of like passive tools that just make dealing with him and make wanting to commit into him less appealing, one of the big things that Zipp normally has is he has that built-in blasting off on his defense, which then allows him to continue to kind of maintain a maximally disruptive position. If your opponent is just like, all right, Zipp is really annoying, I want to just like make him go away, then often you can use blasting off to kind of reset him and keep him in a disruptive spot. But like, even if not, even if actually you're starting to feel the heat, it can then just allow Zipp to really kind of like book it. And, you know, if he ends up from here placing all the way over to, I don't know, there or something like that, then now in the shadow of that terrain, very sort of like far back, you can very kind of quickly try to sort of redirect and sort of say, okay, fine, I can't kind of continue to maintain that position, but I still got a pretty effective activation on my own part. I probably screwed some stuff up for you, and now I can kind of reset and threaten to do more later, right? Like, it didn't cost me a ton. But in my case, maybe the least self-explanatory hire, though maybe Ken is, but at this point, Ken is a model I like. I think he plays particularly well with a couple of with a lot of the keywords in Thunders, but Wastrel is one of the ones that I think he has sort of neat specific synergy with. So it I can maybe get into more detail, but the model that I think is the most apparently out of sorts here is Batari, who is not a model that I hire out of keyword just sort of based on fondness quite as much the same way. But the idea with Batari here, first and foremost, is that while Thunders do have an upgrade that kind of does this same thing, Masked Agent, I believe, is an upgrade that has an effect that says that enemy models cannot declare defensive triggers while they're engaged by the upgrade holder. Batari has Unnerving Presence, which is what was originally on that upgrade. I believe that was a change that was made to the upgrade at some point previously in 3rd edition. And Unnerving Presence is a much, much stronger version of the same effect. Enemy models within Aura 6 cannot declare resistance triggers, may not. And so if Zipp were to try to get really aggressive here, it would just be a little bit too easy for me to then... you see Batari here is sort of starting inside this building, but she has diving charge. She would just charge out, and then immediately, right, even if, I don't know, she then black chokers the follow up on her charge action. Let's say she tries to charge Zipp himself, if he's like crazy aggressive like this, right? Let's say she black chokers the boring conversation on her charge, and then he red jokers defense on her follow-up attack, so like she doesn't actually do anything in her activation. She is still just there, and now Zipp is stuck, right? Zipp cannot leave, except by taking actions on his own activation or trying to do something like, you know, like Bog can try to get him out of there, but then actually you are at a disadvantage because you're dealing with your own sputtering exhaust aura. So I think if Zipp tries to get too aggressive, then just sort of passively Batari is sitting there. She's not necessarily trying to dive up the board proactively, but she's kind of just waiting around like, okay, well, if Zipp tries to commit in a spot where it would be kind of compromising for him to get stuck there, right, then you have to think about, well, there's a pretty good chance he's just going to get stuck there, right? Because then now Batari is here, and say McCabe can now get in there and start knocking Zipp around, right, using his melee to kind of lay into him. I just kind of have access to a lot of resources then to leverage onto Zipp, and the Zipp crew doesn't have a lot of staying power to try to back Zipp up. And I think that that's then just sort of getting towards that game outcome where we're kind of just lining our models up and sort of just like comparing resources and comparing stats. And that was an outcome that, again, maybe doesn't work out in the particular instance, but I think in the majority of cases is better for me. So Zipp and McTavish are going to be trying to do stuff to shoot early, trying to like make inroads, punish me for the fact that I have a fairly aggressively low cash here. I only have 3 soul stones. Optimistically, I will have a few more than that to work with over the course of the game. One of the things that Jessie is generally doing early is she's just kind of like hanging around, looking to find moderate masks to turn into soul stones in my deployment zone, also generating scrap. In that way, she functions somewhat like a prospector, right? In that she's sort of enabling card draw by generating stones, by generating scrap for the keyword draw, the looted supplies draw, and generating stones off of the trigger, with the then upside of once that sort of function is done, a prospector can kind of just sort of try to walk up the board, whereas she actually has a pretty functional gun with her auto displacement and then also drag. She's also a little bit more durable, even though she's not manipulative, because she actually can stone. So anyway, hopefully I'll have more stones, but when you have a stone generation mechanic and you're going a little bit lower, one of the natural responses from your opponent is to try to put pressure on early and try to like actually make you feel the fact that as of the start of the game, I will only have 3, right? So I'll be a little bit limited in terms of what I can do for reduction and all that right away. And then, of course, I would prefer to steal some stones with Desper as well, particularly if like Bog is just trying to like kind of get up in here. Then Desper might well take an activation, hopefully late enough that he's not putting himself in too much danger. Might take an activation like getting onto a vault point for some strat purpose and then just stealing a stone or 2 from Bog. But then a response to that from Brendan is presumably he might want to spend his 6 stones fairly aggressively early, with the idea that if he holds on to them, then essentially that would just be so that some number of them end up in my pool at the end of the day. Maybe just better to spend them, even if it's not for the most value he could possibly get, just so that it's value going to him and not to me. Anyway, so I'm trying to, on my part, kind of roll out a little bit more cautiously. I'm definitely trying to get models in a position so that I am kind of benefiting from the shadow of this building, making a lot of the early shooting just a little bit more challenging to achieve, and thinking some about the sort of blast potential off of Zip Zapper. I do really think that playing for that range damage is one of the more likely sort of like ways to try to make a really significant impact on Zip's part early game. So I'm definitely going to be trying to think about that as much as I possibly can. Otherwise, I am looking to set up... I have the ability with Monaco to look at a Katashiro summon turn 1. Any turn, but I can actually create all 3 of the marker types that she summons off of in this list. I have Shadows from Host, I have Rifts from Batari, and I have Scrap from various sources. So I have a lot of ways to do that. And while I think the most obvious sort of like scheme reason for me to want to do that would be if I wanted to set up my own outflank, right? A Katashiro actually would be kind of a nice mobile activation for me to do that with. I don't think I'm doing that, but even so, one, the fact that the piglets and maybe Burns as kind of a semi-unwilling passenger might signal that the Zip crew is trying to play for outflank, right? Then actually having the ability to create a Katashiro or 2 over the first couple turns to then just start getting out there and making it a little bit hard to safely do that is pretty valuable, right? A Katashiro has reasonable tool sets to get rid of a flying piglet, and one of the reasons that outflank is not the most appealing scheme is you do actually, it's not just like some of the other marker schemes where you just get the marker there and you're fine. You need the models in place as well, right? So there's that. And I'm then trying to essentially play tempo such that I'm not bunching up and giving Zip the ability to, walk once and like get a really kind of like exciting ranged based activation early turn 1, but then also getting to the point where I have models that I'm going to be getting onto the vaults and sort of like getting into scoring spots pretty quickly as of turn 2, and ideally getting to the point where I have a lot of threat on Zipp and I guess Bog and Sammy, but just so that the models in Zipp's crew that are going to be needed to sort of like pull their weight and sort of like do a lot in terms of damage and control are going to be in spots where Brendan doesn't have all of the sort of flexibility in the world as to when they get to activate or sort of like what they do with their activations, that they're going to have to think about what my models are doing to them. Other things I'm definitely thinking about doing early, I could in theory look at a gun attack off of McCabe himself. McCabe does, of course, also have a gun. It's not quite Zip Zapper. It is range 10. It does also have blasts and models damage gain stunned, which is pretty cool. I guess if something really goofy happens and there's like a flying piglet like right next to, I don't know, maybe there's some world where I get some sort of exciting blast going. But probably what I'm actually looking to do in order to create pressure early is to use my passive movement effects, things like moving McCabe probably a little bit with Ken, and the sort of quasi-lure on Batari. She has essentially a lure with a lower TN for some reason, and it drops a rift marker in base contact with the target at the end of the attack, which is not totally upside, actually, weirdly, in this case, because the rule that allows Oni models to ignore rift markers is actually not on the models themselves. It's based on the crew upgrade, so Batari herself weirdly can make the markers, but then would have to deal with them as hazardous from that point forward. But most of the rest of my crew is either largely or wholly able to ignore them. Desper technically only ignores them when moving, so like if Desper was standing on a marker and like banking attacks or whatever, that wouldn't be great. But McCabe totally ignores them, has depths. Ken and Host are incorporeal, so totally ignores them. Jesse also has depths, I believe. And Luna wouldn't ignore them, but I don't know why Luna would be in a position for that to matter. So I can just, a thing when you have a reasonably statted lure on a model with a pretty decent threat, and also because there's a decent chance I'd be having to contend with concealing, even though I don't have all the stones in the world, I could at least consider stoning, right? There's a potential play for me to then kind of get up and throw a lure even at someone like Zipp, right? And bring Zipp in that way and create a lot of pressure and sort of like be able to kind of leverage that off of Batari. That's my, I think, kind of like range threat equivalent early turn 1, unless something in the Zipp crew does something much more aggressive than I expect. I expect some early aggression in trying to like generate sort of reasonable damage on the part of Zipp and McTavish, but I'm talking about McTavish like getting up here with some help. Maybe even we have Bo. I'm not even exactly sure. And maybe even McTavish goes up the middle. I'm not sure. Maybe that he wouldn't, though that feels way more risky for McTavish. I think McTavish is much happier on the ground in this game because McTavish is notably the model in the Zipp crew that like is just going to kind of eat damage if I throw it at him, and if I like move him over and like throw him off, then like he's the guy who like that combination of hazardous damage and fall damage and all that, like that's definitely something Zipp is looking to leverage into my crew, though all those effects in sort of like aggregate don't really work on almost anybody in my crew except Batari, I guess. Everybody is either immune to the movement in the case of Monaco, or basically immune to the terrain in the case of everybody else, but not Batari. But yeah, I think with McTavish, though, if aggression really is the name of the game, there certainly is some sort of opening play where like Bo moves him up, Earl moves him up, and he just like tries to take 3 shots at me turn 1, though the third shot, I guess, would require some sort of marker, which both crews are certainly capable of generating markers, so I don't know, maybe that happens. Certainly something to keep in mind, and I think if McTavish ends up deploying more centrally, right, that would really want him to kind of like be here or something like that early. I think that kind of telegraphs to me that that's sort of the approach that we're taking. We're trying to get McTavish up onto this terrain piece and basically just all of his AP into guns, like just all of it all the time. Anyway, whether it goes that way or whether we go with the more sort of flanking McTavish build, I'm thinking Zipp wants to sort of like stack up as much damage early because it's going to get harder incrementally over the course of the game. And if you don't kind of have enough of an advantage before my sort of relative strengths come online, it's going to get just harder and harder for you. Otherwise, In Your Face is certainly a scheme choice that I think either one of us could think about. I took the option of just like hiring a bunch of 8s. I don't think I would often go below 8 in Thunders in many crews. McCabe is sometimes one of the crews that it's more feasible to think about that with, but you just have a lot of hires at either 8 or 9 that are pretty appealing, so I didn't. And we have the multiple kind of hard to kill 9s in the Zipp crew. Bog is just stat 6 and his sort of hard to woundy thing, which does legitimately matter. It kind of puts a damper on some of my model's ability to pump out damage, but like obviously McCabe is, while the fact that it's not literally hard to wound actually means that it works against McCabe, whereas with a sword it wouldn't work otherwise. McCabe is mostly just min 3. The big thing that Bog has going into McCabe is that he has laugh off, and so McCabe can't get his ram trigger damage or get like fall hazardous damage stuff on Bog. So anyway, I think In Your Face is towards the top of the list of like, this is a scheme that like setting, even if I knew nothing about the 2 crews involved and I just saw this pool, that I would assume most crews would be heavily considering going in, and I think it's fairly reasonable that both crews might be considering it right now. I think both crews could potentially run into some difficulty in, I think it's feasible in either case that like if it's really the game plan, I need to kill this expensive model in a way that works, that it's probably feasible. It seems more likely that the Zipp crew could try to play keep away, certainly with McTavish, just like keep McTavish way away from everything, so that even if I do try to like put damage into him, it's probably not in a situation where In Your Face is going to be scoreable. I don't know where Bog would be going, frankly, that he wouldn't be potentially giving up In Your Face. Like, if he's not attempting to do anything for either of these central strat markers, then like even if that means he's in this weird spot and he's not really that easy for me to try to like set up a situation where I get In Your Face on him, that's just the kind of like, that's so passive and kind of like denial-y, like you don't get to do your one thing, ha ha ha, that like I just don't think you can win games doing that, because like how are you scoring these points if you have like Zipp and like I don't know, like Bo to work with, kind of Sammy, right? Like it just doesn't seem like that's feasible. And none of my 8s are that inherently durable that I think it is just like that unreasonable an ask to get rid of them either. So I kind of think that it's fairly likely both of us are going to look at taking that. I think it's not, this is not a case where like it is a perfect sort of like 10 out of 10 most appealing scheme possible for either crew, but it's still fairly appealing and its baseline is so high. Otherwise, Outflank I think is much, much more realistic for Zipp than for me. It is probably going to be somewhat telegraphed, though. The Piglets don't have to like run out there immediately turn 1. It could definitely be something where they kind of slow play it and then try to set up to do that turns 2+. Let Them Bleed is certainly another scheme that both of us could consider. The cheaper activations in the Piglets and the terrain do allow for some kind of like passive defense of the second point for Zipp, right? Can kind of just try to keep them in spots where it's just difficult for me to attack them at all. Though again, it's not like the Zipp crew has the ability to like summon a lot of chaff or like kind of recoup that AP. They do sort of need to do something. And similarly, right, like Zipp can certainly try to do some splash damage onto my crew, has the blasts and all that. And my 8s are not so durable that it's super infeasible to try to score that first point. So I could see that on either part. If anything, I would say it might seem a little bit more appealing to Zipp than to McCabe for me, but I think it is reasonably appealing for both. Sweating Bullets is certainly another one that I kind of feel has to be a pretty likely pick for either or both of us. There are a few models in either crew. Certainly McCabe for me, probably Batari, maybe Ken. These are models that are likely to be kind of towards the center of the board just because these two center vaults really, really make you want to be sort of in the neighborhood, at least, with a fair number of your models. And those are models that like want to be making attacks and kind of have the ability to exert influence in areas where it's going to be important for them to be in those spots. And then similarly, probably Zipp himself, but then also Bog, right? If Bog isn't even, right? So like if Bog is like anywhere attempting to score any vault, right? Then it is absolutely the case that I can be, not necessarily like saying, oh, Ken is obviously the choice, but you see Ken is now, definitely in qualifying position, right? And if Bog isn't in those spots, then I don't understand what Bog is doing in the game, right? Like what is Bog doing that's like allowing you to win on Brendan's part? So I think it's sort of the flip of of Let Them Bleed, in that I think it is more appealing for me because I have a lot of models that could threaten to be the scoring model, and I think the prospect of just like you have no masters or henchmen within 6 of the center point at the end of the game seems a little bit more feasible for me to accomplish than Brendan. I think I'm just a little bit more likely to kill those models, right? Whereas while it's not like all of my henchmen and masters, right, all of Desper, McCabe, Batari, and Monaco are that incredibly durable, I just have a fair number of them and they're pretty mobile. So I think that is a pretty likely take for me. I don't necessarily always love sledding, but I feel like the combination of this table, this pool, and these crews with some of the hiring decisions that were made really make it a very likely take on my part. Take Prisoner is semi-feasible for either of us. Zipp obviously has some kidnap potential. Probably Ken is the model on my end that he would be looking to do that with, because most of the rest of my models that are going to be reasonably accessible early are not models you can score Take Prisoner off of, right? It can't be a henchman or master. I have access to the lure again off of Batari to, I guess, set it up with. I have the harpoon shot on Jesse. I have some displacement options. Desper kind of has something like that as well. But like the model that I would be scoring off of is probably like Bo, and I think Bo is pretty good at defending a lot of those. He's actually not great at defending the lure because it's a willpower attack and his willpower is not good. But Bo could certainly be played pretty defensively, be played in the shadow and all that. And I think it's just one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's not even do I have the tools to do this feasibly. It's just like, why would I do that? Like, do I not have better things that I could be doing with my time? And I think the answer is almost certainly yes. So in summary then, I think I have the advantage in a fight in this one, and I want to just sort of make sure that I don't take a lot of hits early to kind of give that up, because I think Zipp's engage is a little bit faster and going to be a little bit better over the sort of short term at the beginning of the game. I just don't want to really like allow that to cascade into any disasters. From there, I want to kind of play a sort of consistent attrition game, wear down his threats. He actually doesn't have that many models that are effective threats. Keep in mind that I think really the combination of Zipp and Sammy have really pretty impressive tools to sort of play for the vaults with like sort of displacement and kind of like not direct damage options. So definitely have to sort of be thinking about that, though I think some of that is going to be somewhat offset by the shadow stuff. The vaults and this table, just some sort of like weird stuff with like models being in spots where it's going to be hard to sort of see them and target them from a lot of the table a lot of the time. And so I am trying to kind of like take center control, keep an eye on the sort of cheaper stuff in the Zipp crew to see if I'm being told that outflank is kind of being telegraphed, and try to react to that and sort of have some tools to react with that. If so, that seems fairly likely. Otherwise, on the Zipp crew, in terms of like rough order of probability, I would expect probably actually sweating, maybe most likely first and foremost. Just sweating bullets seems like such a likely pick for both crews in this. And then in your face, let them bleed, and outflank as all kind of somewhat feasible. I think that sweating is a little bit worse for Zipp still, just because the second point thing, let your bleed, might make a little more sense, just because like Zipp does have the AoE damage options. But like some combination of those things, and I think a lot of those sort of play to the same rough game plan on Zipp's part of, just trying to like do impactful things early, try to sort of like avoid giving Zipp up for too little, because I do have the tools to kind of threaten him consistently. And yeah, definitely not playing the beatdown. I think I'm definitely the beatdown in this game, whereas on my part, I definitely think I have my eyes on let them bleed to an extent, but definitely particularly on the combination of sweating bullets and in your face as schemes that feel like they're going to essentially score the most naturally, especially the first point for me in the context of the game. And if I sort of like envision the way that I would like this game to go, and sort of like the way that I would like things to line up, the way that I want to leverage my resources, those are the schemes that feel like I am essentially just doing if the only object were to score the strategy and to do damage to the Zipp crew, those are the schemes that I think I would come the closest to kind of just scoring without actually like having any further incentive to do so, which is often a good sign. Anyway, should be a cool one. Really looking forward to another game with Brendan. By the way, the YouTube clip here I think is roughly as you see it, but I'll let you speculate as to what clip is the name of my crew. If you're curious enough and you can't figure it out, you can definitely ask me in a comment. And delve those secrets. With that. That'll be this one. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you for some sort of recording of something else soon, probably for the game recording. Take care.